Welcome to this edition of Head to Head. I'm your host, Cam McKinney, and this is episode number 320 of the podcast. And on this episode, I'm talking about San Diego Padres outfielder Jurkinson Profar making the Major League Baseball All-Star Game. My favorite thing about baseball's Midsummer Classic, aka the All-Star Game, isn't the game itself. It's not the home run derby. It's when somebody you never expected to make an All-Star team finally does. And this year, the most surprising All-Star is San Diego Padres outfielder Jurkinson Profar. His .313 batting average is third in the entire National League. He scored 52 runs, that's 13th in the league. His 59 runs batted in is 6th. His 100 hits is also 6th in the league. 46 walks is 9th, and his .406 on-base percentage is 2nd in the National League. Profar himself is playing on a team with the San Diego Padres that's filled with superstars who are way more well-known, and yet he's got as many home runs as Fernando Tatis Jr. with 14, and more than Manny Machado, and he's got a higher batting average than batting champion Luis Arraez. Jurkinson Profar was at one point destined for stardom. In 2011, he was ranked by Baseball America as the second best prospect in the Texas Rangers system, and one of the reasons it was hard for him to click with the Rangers was because the team had a star infield that included Elvis Andrus at shortstop and Ian Kinsler at second base. And when the Rangers finally moved on from Kinsler to play Profar, Jurkinson dealt with numerous injuries. To give you some context, the Texas Rangers at that point were coming off of 2 trips to the World Series. They were trying to win it all. It's hard to develop a young player when you're trying to win the World Series. Most players develop into superstars on really bad teams. You've seen it with Steven Strasburg with the Nationals, Bryce Harper with the Nationals. Those guys were able to develop because the Nationals were nothing at that point. The Texas Rangers were trying to win a World Series, so they had to play their veteran players. In the years since he left the Rangers, Profar has spent a season with the Rockies and Oakland A's. This is currently Jurkinson's second stint with the San Diego Padres, a team that has in recent years become known for spending to make a good team. That's why I find it so ironic that one of their best players is one of their least expensive ones. Profar signed a 1-year, $1 million deal this past offseason, and I'm not saying he's been undervalued in the past. We are talking about a career .245 hitter. This is a coming out party for a 31-year-old. And I think the message you can take from looking at the Jurkinson Profar situation is baseball in and of itself is not a consistent sport. Paying somebody a boatload of money does not mean they are going to be good in the next 5 years, because a player can develop over time. There was no metric, there was no stat that said that you should start believing in Jurkinson Profar. The analytics were not on his side, yet the San Diego Padres brought him back, and they are being rewarded for that. I don't know what they've saw in him. I don't know who should be getting the credit for Jurkinson Profar being an all-star this season, but whoever it is deserves a tremendous amount of credit, and so does Jurkinson Profar, because there are so many baseball players who were supposed to be the next big thing that never got their moment. And this is Jurkinson Profar taking advantage of his moment. He's playing every day, and he's playing like one of the best players in the sport. And this to me is something that can only happen in the sport of baseball, where a guy can play a decade, have absolutely no one talk about him, become a forgotten player that some label a bust, and then out of nowhere has a breakout season. In other sports, good players can become great players, but Profar, by all metrics, was a below average hitter, and for at least this moment, he's one of the best. As a baseball fan, I romanticize a guy who struggles, because failure is a massive aspect of this sport. The history of baseball is filled with stories like this. Rick Ankiel struggled as a pitcher, then he came back as a hitter. Now, he wasn't a great hitter, but the fact that he was able to come back at all is a great story. Daniel Bard is a guy who struggled with the Boston Red Sox after they made him a starting pitcher. Then he won Comeback Player of the Year in 2020 after being gone from the sport for years. Carlos Pena is a guy who didn't work with the Detroit Tigers. He didn't work with the Boston Red Sox. He didn't work with the Oakland A's. Then he goes to the worst franchise in the sport, the Tampa Bay Rays, and becomes one of the best home run hitters in the sport and leads them to a World Series appearance. This is what the sport of baseball does. It has these kind of redemptive arcs that you don't see in the other sports. And listen, this doesn't necessarily mean that this is who Profar is moving forward. It's possible though, and this season is likely going to get him a nice payday by the end of it. But even more important, it gives him a moment to shine. It's a redemptive arc, again, that you don't see in most sports. I mean, nobody was talking about this guy at the beginning of the season. Nobody's been talking about this guy in a serious way since about 2013 when people cared about his development. But I remember at the time when Jurkinson Profar was coming up, people were saying the Texas Rangers were going to be good for a long time because of this guy. I mean, this guy had the hype around him and he never quite lived up to it. And now he's doing so at age 31. You're seeing the talent that he has. And I think he is benefiting from playing with guys like Luis Arraez, Manny Machado, Fernando Tatis Jr. I think he's on a good team and he's definitely benefiting from that because he's not the most feared hitter on that team. But you have to give this guy credit for just hanging around all of these years and finally having a moment, because there are so many top prospects in the history of the sport that never get this moment. And this isn't a guy who just made the National League All-Star team. This is a guy who's going to be in the starting lineup for the National League All-Star game. Here's what Profar's teammate Fernando Tatis Jr. said about Jurkinson making the All-Star game. Quote, "He totally deserves it. It's as simple as that. The guy's been one of the best players in the game this year. He's also been one of the best players for the Padres so far. He definitely deserves to be an all-star. The man has put in the work and I'm just happy for him." And that's coming from a guy who has lived up to the hype. I mean, there's so many in the history of the sport that never became the thing that we all thought that they were going to become, and they don't get to have a season like Jurkinson Profar is having. According to Brian Murphy of MLB.com, there have only been 8 other players since 1933 to be first-time All-Stars in their 11th season or later. Notably, Raul Ibanez made it for the first time in 2009, his 14th MLB season. Nick Markakis in 2018, his 13th season. Walt Weiss in 1998, his 12th Major League season. And in those cases, those are 3 guys who had decent careers and people talked about them. Markakis was an underrated player. Ibanez had some really good years, and Weiss is a former Rookie of the Year. Profar has not been on the radar of most baseball fans for nearly a decade. And look, basketball has had some surprising all-stars. Kyle Korver made the all-star game with the Hawks, and then Goran Dragic made the all-star game with the Miami Heat. But those are guys that we always thought were very good basketball players. They're not superstar players. I think the equivalent of Jurkinson Profar making the Major League All-Star game in the NBA would be if Markelle Fultz was an NBA All-Star starter in next year's All-Star game. That's the kind of wild story I'm talking about, where all of the hype was on Markelle Fultz. He was the number 1 pick and then he amounted to almost nothing. I know he's still in the league, but that would be the equivalent, and that just doesn't happen in the sport of basketball. There is more consistency in that sport. There's more consistency in football, and I don't even really want to talk about football because the Pro Bowl is a joke. There's so many alternates nowadays that almost anyone goes down as a Pro Bowler. What I like most about this is that it comes out of nowhere. There was no last season, Jurkinson Profar is finally becoming a good player and now he's a great one. No, absolutely no one was paying attention to Jurkinson Profar last year on the San Diego Padres, a team that had Juan Soto, a team that had Manny Machado, a team that had Fernando Tatis Jr., a team that has Yu Darvish. It was all about the All-Stars, and then they barely bring him back on a 1-year, $1 million deal, and they play him every day, and now he's an all-star starter. I mean, this kind of story just doesn't happen, and it rarely ever happens in the sport of baseball. That to me is cool. I just think we all get swept up in the legacy of making the All-Star game. Like, it just gets tedious when it becomes all about Derek Jeter making his 15th appearance in the All-Star game. Yes, that's nice, and Derek Jeter is an all-time player, and David Ortiz is an all-time great player, but how many times do we have to talk about their All-Star game appearances? It should be about the first-time All-Stars and talking about them and how interesting it is that they're making the game. I mean, all the talk right now is about Paul Skeens making the All-Star game and starting the game, and that's well-deserved. He's been a beast since coming up for the Pittsburgh Pirates. But for me, the more interesting story is Jurkinson Profar, because this isn't a guy anyone was talking about, and this is a guy that used to have that kind of hype around him. And you have to imagine that he's appreciating this All-Star game appearance more than most because of the struggles he's been through. Again, he didn't live up to the hype with the Texas Rangers. Then he's given another chance with the Rockies and A's. Doesn't quite live up to the hype. Now he's been on the San Diego Padres for a while now. He's been okay, but he's never been close to being this good. And now all of a sudden he's having his breakout season. Sometimes sports can come up with a better narrative than a movie can, and this to me is a great narrative of a player in Jurkinson Profar. And who even knows if he's going to continue on this pace? Maybe he's going to revert back to who he's been throughout his major league career, but for this one moment, he is showing you what he was capable of and what people saw in him when he was a highly touted prospect. That's another thing that's different in baseball than in other sports. I mean, most first-round draft picks in the NBA turn out to be halfway decent. And I know in football there are a lot of busts, but in baseball you can just forget about these guys because they have to go down to the minors. You forget about them for years, and then by the time they come up to the majors, they just never hit the ground going, and then you forget about them altogether, and that's what happened to Jurkinson Profar. Again, he came up with a team that had Josh Hamilton. That's a redemptive arc in and of itself. He went through the drug issues and then became one of the best players in baseball, led the Rangers to 2 World Series appearances. Nelson Cruz was on that team, Elvis Andrus, Adrian Beltre. I mean, that team was star-studded. There was absolutely nowhere to play Jurkinson Profar. The best season he had with Texas was in 2018, where he had .254 with 20 homers and 77 RBIs. And yes, that's okay, but I think what Texas was expecting was for this guy to become the next face of the organization, to be as good as Ian Kinsler, to be even better than Elvis Andrus. They thought he was going to keep the ball rolling and that they were going to continue to make playoff appearance after playoff appearance. I think hype is both a good thing and a bad thing when it comes to young players in sports, because when there's so much hype around a player, it makes you give up on them even sooner than maybe you should, because you need them to become the great player you expected them to be. Like that season that Profar had in 2018 is fine, but guess what? The Texas Rangers immediately gave up on him and sent him to Oakland because he wasn't the Jurkinson Profar that they were expecting. Like, Paul Skeens needed to be this good right now for the Pittsburgh Pirates because the Pittsburgh Pirates need him to be this good because their expectations around him are sky high. He can't just be another guy. Jurkinson Profar could not just have been another guy for the Texas Rangers. He needed to become one of their foundational pieces of the franchise, and he didn't become that guy, so they had to move on. And this is maybe the even craziest aspect of the story about Jurkinson Profar making the All-Star game. On January 27, 2021, Profar signed with the San Diego Padres to a 3-year, $20 million contract, and he was okay in those 3 years with the Padres. He was mainly a utility player. He would have moments, he would have flashes of being very good. So then this past offseason, they barely bring him back. They give him 1 year, $1 million with a $1.5 million in incentives. I mean, he is playing like a guy who should be being paid like $10 to $15 million for this this season alone. But his value was so low because he's a 30-year-old who was coming off of a season with the Colorado Rockies where he only hit 8 home runs. So the idea being, if you can't hit in Colorado, where can you hit the baseball? And San Diego is not a ballpark where hitters come to thrive. At home this season, Profar has a .303 batting average. I just think it's so wild that this guy is an all-star this season. Julio Rodriguez, who is thought of as one of the best players in baseball, and now he's finally breaking out this season, didn't make the all-star game, yet Jurkinson Profar did. That's how crazy the sport of baseball can be, that this forgotten figure can come out of nowhere and have you thinking and showing you that he's one of the best players in the game, at least for this moment in time. And that's something that we underappreciate in the history of sports, is moments in time. We all remember Linsanity, Jeremy Lin thriving with the New York Knicks, a team that had Carmelo Anthony, a team that had Amare Stoudemire. I'm not saying this is getting the publicity like that, but more people should be paying attention to what Jurkinson Profar is doing on the San Diego Padres. If you're a baseball fan, watch this guy play this year. He has been exciting. I've seen the highlights. I've started to pay attention. That's why I'm doing a podcast on him. I think it's the most astounding story in the All-Star game in like a decade and a half. The fact that this guy is an All-Star. I mean, he was basically taking advantage of his last chance. He's making $1 million guaranteed dollars this year, again on a team that's obsessed with paying guys so much money. They paid Joe Musgrove, they paid Tatis, they paid Darvish, yet it's this one guy making $1 million that is bringing so much to the team, even more so than some of those guys I mentioned. And in this case, I don't care how he finishes the season, just the fact that he is an All-Star game starter is the story in and of itself, because again, we haven't been talking about this guy in forever. When was the last time a baseball fan brought up the name Jurkinson Profar? And again, I'm young enough to remember when there was real hype around this guy, that the Texas Rangers were going to have another guy coming in to play with the likes of Adrian Beltre and Josh Hamilton, that the good times were going to continue because Jurkinson Profar was in the wings. It's not every day that a career .245 hitter is an all-star game starter. It would be one thing if he just made the all-star game because the players and the managers were taking notice, but the fans actually voted him in because that's how good of a story this is, that this guy is having this season. He was this close to becoming a guy you look in at Wikipedia and you go, what happened to Jurkinson Profar? And instead of becoming fully forgotten, he makes an all-star game. I mean, that's something. He's never going to win an MVP. He's never going to be Rookie of the Year like some people thought he was probably going to be. He's never going to be an all-time great player, but he's able to have this moment on the San Diego Padres. And that to me is something really special. And that's the best story going into the All-Star game. I'm going to be watching some of this game to watch Profar, because to me, the All-Star game is about the young players coming up like the Paul Skeens. That's why people upset that he's starting this game are insane. He's the future of the sport. And it should be about the guys who came out of nowhere and made the All-Star team. And that's Jurkinson Profar. Another guy is Stephen Kwan. I mean, Stephen Kwan on the Cleveland Guardians is close to a .400 batting average. That's another guy I wanted to shout out. But even his story isn't as insane as Profar's. I mean, Kwan's been an okay player. He's been an everyday outfielder for the Guardians. He's just now having an insane season. Profar was nowhere for the longest time. I mean, he was a utility player, a .245 hitter, a guy basically on teams to give the real stars a day off, and now he is a real star in 2024. Now, again, I don't know how long it's going to last, but I'm going to enjoy seeing Jurkinson Profar have success on a baseball diamond. I think it's a cool story. I think you should know about it, and that's why I did a podcast on him and him making the All-Star game for the first time. Because it's not something I or anyone could have ever expected a guy who was touted to be a star for the Texas Rangers back in 2011 to finally live up to the hype more than a decade later. It's hard to watch Profar have a season like this and not wonder what could have been if he was in a better situation to develop as a young player, because again, I don't think that the Texas Rangers being a good team was the best thing for Jurkinson Profar. Here's what the Rangers manager Ron Washington said at the time to ESPN Dallas, quote, "He's in a bad situation for a young kid having to be a utility guy so young," end quote. If Profar started his career with a really bad team like the Pittsburgh Pirates, they would have given him more time to grow and develop. What was happening with Texas was a win now mentality, which isn't the best mentality to have when developing young players in the sport of baseball. Alas, it didn't work out in Texas, but he's finally having a moment with the Padres, and everyone should take notice. I'll say it one more time. Jurkinson Profar is a starter for the NL All-Star Game. Thanks for listening to this edition of Head to Head. I'm Cam McKinney, and there'll be a new episode of the podcast every Monday on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, so please rate, review, and subscribe.